My name is Rachel Sample. I'm the Community Services Grants Manager at IHCDA, and I oversee the team that administers CoC, ESG, and HOPWA funds with all of you fabulous partners across the state. Today, we are talking specifically about Continuum of Care program and the renewal process, and in particular, the policies that are a part of the renewal process. Alicia, Jorita, keep an eye on the lobby for me and let folks in because we are going to get started. So last week we had our first session for this year's renewal process prep. And this week we are going to be talking about a new set of topics with a review of some items from last week as well, just to make sure we held on to some key concepts, especially because I'm going to be using more and more terminology as time goes on. And that might be a good idea for us to just kind of refresh a few things before I do that. I'm not going to pretend everybody has a photographic memory. So what are we going to talk about today? Today we are going to talk primarily about our policies that govern the Continuum of Care funding process each year, and the policies that the CoC Funding and Resources Committee uses, as well as the CoC board use to dictate the process. So some things to know. We are going to talk a little bit more to make sure everybody's familiar with what you are going to need to do to renew your project. If you are a renewal project, I'm anticipating that you'd like to renew it again and continue to operate it. So we want to make sure you are, again, familiar with what you will need to do in order to meet those expectations and renew successfully. The next thing that we're going to go over is just some expectations that the CoC is held to during the competition. We'll talk about these primarily at one point in the presentation, but kind of revert back to them later on because HUD expresses the expectations for the competition in a number of ways. So I want to hit on a few things, as well as some things that the board has held up and upheld as policy as for expectations for all of us, we IHCDA, renewal projects, new projects during the competition. We will then dive into the competition policies, and then we'll talk a little bit about how will this impact your project. We'll kind of address that as we go, but we'll kind of give you some ideas for next steps as you prepare to renew in the next couple of months. So defining some key terms, again, I'm going to hit on a couple of these in particular. We spoke about these last week, and we have a recording and a copy of those slides available. I am working on getting that out to folks. Unfortunately, we are having some issues with how we can share files. So just kind of navigating that right now, but I'm trying to get that out quickly to anybody who hasn't had a chance to look at it yet. The grant inventory worksheet is a record that we complete for HUD that indicates all of our renewable grants that are eligible in the competition. We usually conduct the GIW, as we call it, in March to May. The last year, I believe they were giving us the NOFO and giving us the GIW at the same time, which made it extra fun. So we are always responsive to what HUD does, and we can't really set that calendar. But what we will do is reach out to you when we have that GIW and ask for you to review it and understand your corrections. For those of you who are in IHCDA subrecipient grants, we do a very fine review of that to make sure everything is correct. We do a very light review of non-IHCDA funded grants just because we are subrecipients, just because we are less familiar with some of your budget line items and things like that. So a reallocation, this is a big one we need to keep in mind today because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about reallocation today, is when funds shift in whole or part from an existing project to a new project. So primarily, what does that mean for you as a renewal? It means when a portion of your project is reallocated, money is taken out of your project, and that money that's taken out is made available to new projects to apply for that money. We're going to talk about when reallocation happens and why later on, but essentially think of reallocation as meaning reduce for you as a renewal project. Reducing your funding means we have funding available for other folks because we have essentially a pie we're asked to divide up by HUD. And so the pie, while it does kind of grow a little bit, it's still how we slice it. And if we have reallocation, it means we're taking a portion of someone's pie piece to give to somebody else. A consolidation is when we take two grants and push them into one grant. We don't have any policies about this because there's really, it's completely your choice to consolidate, and there's not really any administrative policy impacts for you to consolidate. So I'll hit just very lightly on consolidation as we talk about how it might interact with other policies or things like that. But it is ultimately an administrative choice and doesn't truly impact any of the decisions we make at a board level, given the scope and scale of the CoC funding we operate. Expansion is a new project, and expanding your project means you are adding funds to an existing project. I saw a couple minutes ago, my friend Pam Brookshire, hi Pam, hopped on the call. She and her agency were approved this year for an expansion on their grant. So when you apply for that expansion, it is a new project, but what happens is when that funding is awarded, it becomes an addition to the existing grant funds you have. So instead of applying for a brand new grant that operates completely separately every time you'd like more CoC money, you can actually apply to just add money to what you have already. Hi, Pam. Next is that we have our internal renewal program application, our renewal application process, the application process you all engage in is called the IRPA, and we will talk more about that today. The NOFO is our next term, and it's our notice of funding opportunity. It's where we apply for the CoC funding. And again, timeline-wise, we're typically doing that from July to end of September. The DV bonus project funds are a dedicated line within the CoC competition that is essentially like a set aside where it is a distinct competition that's happening during the broader competition. So those CoC funds, yeah, great. I'll get to that question. Those CoC funds are kind of set aside. So they're still competitive, but there's often less competition in the DV bonus. So sometimes it's easier for us to get DV bonus projects through than if we were to just try and put them in the regular ranking as a DV project. I saw a question come through from Kelly. I will address that now since we're not going to talk a ton about expansions later on. So if you are a renewal project, you are applying for your funding in your renewal. And if you would like to add money to your project, meaning you want to increase your budget, you will apply for a new project, which will be an expansion. So everything that you'd have to do for a new project, you have to do in order to apply for an expansion. The same is actually true for a transition project, which we will talk about later. That's when you take your project from one type to another type. Like let's say you have a rapid rehousing project and you want to make it a supportive housing project. You do some things for that, and that's called a transition. And we will talk specifically about that later because there's a couple of implications there I want to make sure we cover. So yes, you are essentially filling out two applications. And if you were to do the eSNAPS process as a direct recipient, since I know Kelly is, you would be doing a full eSNAPS application for that expansion. And you just make sure you hit certain buttons in the application itself to make sure that HUD knows it's an expansion and not a separate grant. So the ranking is our list of projects that we submit to HUD, and we do that, as you might expect, based upon the name, in rank order. The HUD also calls this the project priority listing, but it is our rank order of projects. We finally, our last note here is what is our collaborative application? That is the detailed application we outline to HUD all of our CoC achievements and activities. It's submitted alongside all of your renewal grants and the new projects. Essentially, when we go to submit the CoC NOFO to HUD, we have to hit two big buttons. We have to submit collaborative application, and separately, we have to submit priority listing. So both of those together are our application to HUD, and that is what kind of makes, especially in comparison to some funding applications, this process unique. I can easily hit one button and not the other, but it's very important that I hit both or we're in trouble. So one thing, just a couple other terms I want to define because they start to get a little bit layered here as we talk more into policy, and I want to make sure I'm being clear about some things. In some cases, this may not be applicable to you as an organization because you as an organization receive funding directly from HUD and you operate that CoC grant to administer a project in the local community in which you are organized to operate. Your CoC grant is a project and it is a one-to-one match. In other cases, we have some partners both by choice and by inheritance, essentially, of old CoC grants that are grouped together where we have a CoC grant and then we have individual projects inside of that grant that all fit together to be what is submitted to HUD. Especially when we talk about the NOFO, the priority listing we give to HUD, those are grants. They are not just projects. So as we talk more about policy implications, if you're operating a grant like we do at IHTDA in some cases with more than one project inside of it, all of those projects come together in the priority listing as a single grant. And we'll get more into actually what that means in a moment, but it is kind of weird. So just to differentiate in technical terms, the grant is an allocated amount that is to an agency or group of agencies to complete the activities in your application. So your eSNAPS application is your grant application. If you have more than one agency in a CoC grant application, we're going to talk about all of the work of all of those projects inside that application itself. The grant itself is listed in the GIW. So the grant inventory worksheet, some of you who are in some of these grouped projects will remember, you'll see, that email come out from us and you'll say, hey, wait, that's not my budget for the CoC2 or the integrated project. That's right. That's because it's two budgets mixed together but for two projects. So in some of these cases, it gets a little bit confusing as a project recipient or administrator that you're like, wait, why is my grant not here? It actually is. It's a part of a larger grant you're operating a project inside of. So again, grants can have multiple projects. So when I will do my best today to try and use the term grant when I mean the whole picture, and project when we're talking about individual subrecipients or individual operated grant or projects, if you will. And I want to show you a picture of what this would look like to HUD and from our perspective as a collaborative applicant. So as the collaborative applicant, we are not the funder, right? We are submitting the grant application on behalf of the balance of state. And HUD sees here that there are 3 grants that are being operated. There's an IHTDA DV bonus, transitional housing to rapid rehousing. There's an IHTDA South Shore Commons grant. And there is this directly contracted grant with Shalom Community Center doing business as Beacon. And the agency's grant is here. Now, who is administering those projects? In the case of the DV bonus projects we have here, Alternatives has a THRRH project they operate. St. Elizabeth's Catholic Charities has one. MHA of Boone County has one. So this is an example of 3 projects operating inside one grant. And the same is true of our CoC2 project, CoC3. Again, some of our IHTDA subrecipient projects, we've got multiple projects inside a single grant. There is not, for those of you who consolidate, maybe you think of this the same way, because I know in some cases, some of our direct HUD funded partners may be operating some pretty distinct projects inside of a larger grant. Maybe you're operating on multiple properties or multiple communities and you kind of treat those differently. But to HUD, it's one big budget. And for us, we are operating these little projects alongside you to support you in that work. Then we have, in the case of the South Shore Commons grant, Sojourner Truth House has operating that grant. It's essentially a one-to-one. We pass that money through to Sojourner Truth House, and they implement that grant project in the community. And then again, this is a direct HUD funded project at Shalom Beacon, and they are operating it themselves all on their own, directly receiving those funds and administering the project in their local community. So I'm just trying to set that stage because, again, it can be a little bit confusing, especially if you are in this scenario where you're part of one of these larger grants. When I talk about some things, you'll see some implications for policies as we go through. All right, what is our process for renewal projects? Well, our process that we are going to be implementing this year, we will continue to do the process where we request those GIW selection or corrections. We're going to be, of course, asking you to be preparing for the application process itself. Are you going to renew your project? Maybe your agency is considering not renewing. Are you going to decide to reallocate some funding? Are you not spending all of your grant funds and you want to talk with us about what it would look like to reduce your grant award? Do you want to take, if you are operating multiple HUD grants, do you want to take those separate HUD grants and turn them into a single HUD grant and operate maybe multiple projects inside of them as an agency, or consolidate it all internally for you as an organization, depending on how you operate? And then we really just want to know in advance of the competition so we can support you and so that we can check to make sure that everything looks good in eSNAPs for you. And then lastly, do you want additional funding beyond what your grant currently operates with to provide more services, more rental assistance? And if you want to do that, you're going to need to apply for an expansion, which, as I referenced earlier, means you will have to apply for a new project. You are going to prepare for and complete your renewal application, or IRPA, and then we will go ahead and score that alongside our Funding and Resources Committee and review your scoring report. So we will provide a scoring report back to you that tells you what your score was. And you can then appeal that decision if you feel like there are some corrections that you needed to make, or there's some errors that were involved in the scoring of your application. We will also ask you that, especially if you are a direct HUD funded partner, Howard later this spring/summer, depending on when the NOFO drops, will ask you guys, especially who are direct HUD funded, to attend an eSNAP session where we go through and show you what you need to do in eSNAPs. It's extremely, extremely important that what is in eSNAPs is right. We do our best to check everything that we can, but if you don't do what you need to do in eSNAPs, we can't do it for you if you were direct HUD funded. So I know this last year, we were the Thursday before the funding was due, and we could not figure out why we were short in our funding requests in the priority listing for renewal projects. And it's because one of our partners had not hit the submit button on their renewal project in eSNAPs. And if you don't hit that button so that we can see it, it's just invisible to us. So it's just super important that you attend that session later this spring/summer, especially if you're direct HUD funded, because on the IHCDA side, there's nothing we can do to do that for you, short of getting your username and login and doing that for you, which I also have had to do in a very weird circumstance at the request of an agency. I should also share that somebody called me and asked me because they were locked out or couldn't get in at the time. So the last thing I'll share is that if if you go through the process, you see your score and you're like, okay, this is fine, but then we must also produce that ranking list to you. It is a requirement of HUD that we notify you as an applicant of where you are in the ranking. And if you have concerns or questions about where you are in the ranking, that is an appeal you can make as well. So when we talk about the appeals process later, that's something that you activate if you feel like a policy was misapplied or something was mishandled. And we can talk more about that in just a few minutes. So what are some expectations that we should anticipate? How are projects chosen for DV bonus? We probably won't get to that today, Kelly, but I will get to that next week. I might hit on a couple things next week, though. What are HUD's expectations in the competition? What are the standards or requirements that we are evaluated on as it regards to the competition? So last week, I spent a lot of time talking about that the CoC, as a part of you applying for this funding, is evaluated on a whole host of activities that we do year round. Well, other things that we get evaluated on are actually whether or not we are conducting the competition itself correctly. So just a couple of things that we have to do every year. HUD requires us to do this. HUD requires that we have a competitive process. If we do not have a competitive process, we lose points on our application, and the last thing we want to do is lose points on anything we can avoid. We are asked to evaluate projects on objective criteria and performance criteria. So we have to actually have a certain percentage of the points in our application that we send to you. That IRPA has to have a certain percentage of those points based upon system performance, and a certain percentage of those points have to have objective questions. So it can't be, an interpretive narrative where, I might look at it and say that's 3 points, and Joe Rita might look at it and say, like, no, I'd give that 5. So it has to be objective, truly objective criteria. There's also an evaluation of how our renewal and new project applications support the federal priorities. And I should say all of these are down every year in the NOFO, so I can't give you exact percentages of what we would expect to see in this year's application tool, but I can give you estimates because we don't usually make a lot of changes year over year because HUD's usually pretty close year over year on percentages they want to see in the applications for new and renewal projects. We have to give you a project score. So there's no mystery. We have to be able to produce that for you, and we have to show it to you. Now, what it does not specifically require is for me to give you a report that gives you every single point you missed in the score itself. Now, if you ask for that, we will provide it to you. We can provide that to you, not a problem. But that's one reason why when we give you that scoring list or the scoring report, you might see questions grouped together. You might see a number, you might just see in the ranking, you'll see, oh, we got 70 points. We don't have to give you in any format the breakdown. We will give you the breakdown if you ask for it. You have to have the score be a part of how you're ranked. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense, and HUD wouldn't expect us to say, hey, we're going to evaluate you and score you, and then, just rank you alphabetically. So that score should play into ranking. Now, it doesn't say it can be the only factor, but primarily in our balance of state, it is. And again, when we get to policies, you'll see that. Ranking and all of the processes involved in the funding decision making have to be as transparent as we can make them. So if you have an appeal, you must be allowed to have an appeals process. You must be allowed to make that suggestion or recommendation or request for yourself. We have to make sure that we have meeting minutes for any meetings we make decisions on. We have votes for things that need votes and things like that. The ranking itself must be approved by the CoC board. And again, we'll talk more about what that means later as far as who's involved in that decision. And then if, let's say you as an organization are not selected to be ranked, that can happen. If you were to not meet threshold criteria for some reason and you were to not selected to be ranked, this is whether you're a new or renewal project, you can, if you exhaust our appeals process that we have, you can appeal directly to HUD and submit your application independently, and HUD can decide whether or not the project can come in. I hope that never ever happens, because that would obviously be a really tumultuous situation, but it is something that you should be aware of that you're allowed to do. And HUD outlines how you would do that if you ever had to in the NOFO itself. So if you were getting to that point, you would have that information provided to you, and that would be dependent on what the NOFO said as far as what that process would look like. I have never been a part of a project directly applying to HUD, so that I hope I never have to be. Okay, so what are some other expectations that I can tell you about the competition, especially as it relates to you all as renewal projects? First, that the CoC board does have expectations in that project are meeting the performance expectations, as in, we have the application tool itself. If you choose not to participate in the application tool, I would anticipate a negative outcome when it comes to your funding decision from the board, because they're expecting you to adhere to the performance expectations. And the biggest way we measure performance is through the annual application process for renewal grants. So that is a part of the expectation, is that you are engaging with the process and fully participating and submitting those materials and doing that in a timely way, and that you're doing it in a correct way and not, not paying attention or submitting things wrong. Especially if you are an IHCDA subrecipient, we are much more in touch with our folks about monitoring, but the same would be true if you were a monitor, you were directly with HUD and you were being monitored. If you were not meeting those monitoring requirements, you could have some negative impacts on the funding decision related to your grant. So if you are refusing to comply for some reason, or if you have been given a list of required changes to your program and you were not making those changes, the CoC board could decide to essentially not include the project in the ranking or completely reallocate the project or a part of the project. Board members must adhere to a conflict of interest policy, and we'll talk about that later, but just know that that is an expectation within the board itself, and an expectation of every board member that they're adhering to that. As far as what is some things to also know is that, funding and resources is the committee of the board that is most involved with the entire CoC NOFO process. Projects are reviewed by funding and resources. The ranking is reviewed by that. We are producing at IHCDA a lot of these materials, and the committee is engaging with the materials like the ranking, making sure it's correct, making sure it meets our policies, and then doing that approval or making other recommendations or changes to whatever we need to do to, if we've made a mistake. The funding and resources committee is the board entity that's accountable for ensuring that we have adherence to that. Because the CoC board is ultimately the one who votes on all of it, they've delegated a lot of these, the minutia to this committee to address. And then the Funding and Resources Committee is actually the committee that develops the policies. So they develop and approve those policies for recommendation to the board. And just like the ranking itself, the policies about how the ranking was produced and how the competition was run are also approved by the CoC board. Again, non-conflicted portions of the board. So just a couple of things to remind you of too, as far as what we see as expectations from HUD, especially as we enter the competition. What are the trends, the philosophies that we know HUD is going to want to prioritize for us in the competition that we may push down to you through the renewal application process? We know that HUD wants to see grants operating with a housing first mindset, and that they're going to ask us questions to make sure we have asked performance-based questions, in particular system performance-based questions in the notice. We're going to talk more about the questions next week, so we can talk more about that, but the system performance measures are a big part of what HUD wants to see, especially for our project applicants. We know that HUD wants to see questions in our renewal and new project application that talk about addressing disparity and equity. We know that just generally they want to see, and we see this more in new projects than renewals because they can kind of bring more new things on for new projects, is coordination with housing and healthcare. Those two systems have been a big component of the competition in the last few years. And so likewise, we have introduced criteria or updated our scoring to align with some of these trends, these philosophies, so that we can better align ourselves and score better in order to ensure we get more funding. So let's dive into the heavy stuff now of the policies themselves. I say heavy just in that they're policies and maybe they're not your cup of tea. So I see these policies as being very well informed and based on a lot of experience from our board. So I don't necessarily think any of these policies are punitive. They're just what the policies are. So when I say heavy, I just mean we're going to get into some real language here for a little bit. So we have a set of policies that govern what happens during the competition. Essentially, just as when you think about how you operate your project, you document everything in order to make sure you can get paid for it, right? That's how we administer funding. We have to document everything so that we can make sure we're compliant with the funding requests that we're making. So we have to have processes around this, and we have to document our processes every year when we go to submit. And if we have any times where we're implementing, we have to document how we aligned with those things. So the main policies I want to talk about are the conflict of interest policy, the ranking policy, the reallocation policy, the renewal and new project scoring policy, and the appeals policy. This is primarily what the policy book is made of. And if you would like to, I'm going to send you all a link of where you can find these policies if you want to read along. I'm going to primarily base upon what we have in writing and approved right now. Because as it stands right now, the board and the Funding and Resources Committee haven't made any permanent changes to policies. I am happy to answer any questions about what we think is coming. But as it stands right now, we're pretty much going to have, I would say, with very small changes in some key areas, likely the exact same set of policies moving into this next year. Unless the NOFO does something crazy, then we may have to add some policies. So right there is a link to where you can go to the internal competition page. And on that page, you will see a copy of the policies. We have to post them as a part of the competition. So first, conflict of interest. And I'm just briefly going to hit on this in case you're not familiar with what a conflict of interest policy is. First, that individuals who are involved with decisions cannot receive funding. They cannot be on the board of an agency that receives funding. They cannot be a staff member of an agency that receives CoC funding. They can't, even if they are receiving an $8,000 coordinated entry grant, if they are funded from the CoC funding stream, they cannot be involved in decisions directly related to funding. Now, the Funding and Resources Committee members, the way the board handles this is essentially they have a non-conflicted committee. The entire committee itself has no funded partners on it. And then at the board level, when things come for vote as a recommendation of the committee, only non-conflicted members can participate. So for those of you who are board members, you know that you are either in non-funding decision related kind of things, but just general policy stuff, you're often asked to abstain if it's a CoC thing. In this situation, we actually have folks go into a waiting room and sit and wait until the discussion is over. And if we were to be in person, we'd ask everybody to get up, leave the room, and walk out to wait till over. So we don't conduct discussion in front of funded partners. There's no expectation of any influence if you are receiving funding. So then that's pretty straightforward, right? I think we're all very familiar with conflict of interest if you are a nonprofit organization, but what is the ranking policy? So there's a philosophy just in general I wanted to present to you all that is a part of our ranking policy. This is directly out of policy document. The policies about ranking align with this philosophy. First, that we want to be focused on performance. The CoC program wants us to be focused on performance, and we as a balance of state want to fund our CoC projects that have great performance. And we should incentivize everything we can to support those projects and ensure that our highest performing projects are most likely to receive funding. We want to encourage folks through our scoring criteria and how we evaluate them to do evidence-based practices, to engage in housing first, most particularly, and to make sure that they're really engaging the CoC funding. So ineffective expenditures where you're underspending on your grant is something that is often seen as a performance issue as well as just an under expenditure issue, which is why you will see in our renewal application, you will actually see questions about how much you spent in the last spend down year. So we evaluate you on that in addition to having it apply to any other policy of the CoC. And then finally, if we have projects that are not performing, then we should try and bring in new projects. We should try and do our best, whether it is through, just a partial reallocation or a total reallocation, whatever it might be. We want to bring in new money, and the way we bring in new money is both for applying for it and ensuring that the money that we're spending is effectively administered. And there are all sorts of reasons why folks underspend on a grant. So there's never a one size fits all rationale, but that the CoC board is going to take a look at that every year, and HUD expects us to take a look at it every year. So let's talk more about the ranking policy before we get to the reallocation. This is, I'm not going to beat on this too hard because I think we've talked about this quite a bit. You are all competitively ranked, and the only time that competitive ranking is not 1-to-1, where you scored 70 points, so therefore you're ranked here, and somebody who scored 71 would be ranked right above you, is if you are a new project with less than 1 year of operating. So our colleagues over at Beacon, who had the new rapid rehousing project in Bloomington, they were not competitively ranked with anybody last year because they were just put into the ranking wherever they kind of fit in. Because they hadn't been even in existence long enough to have data. So it doesn't make sense to have us do that. Same thing is true with the transfer from one project operator to another. So our friends, we've had some recent project transfers happen. And in that case, we're not going to evaluate a project operator, an agency, when they've only been maybe operating that grant for a year or 4 or 5 months, when the previous had been operating it for a year or more. So again, not enough data, not really enough information for us to competitively rank that project. We're going to fit it in kind of wherever we can and make sure that we do what we can to protect it for funding. The last group of projects that are not competitively ranked, but are just put somewhere in the ranking to ensure they receive funding, are infrastructure grants that the board has determined are necessary to operate the CoC program. So coordinated entry grants and HMIS grants are not competitively ranked in the process. Projects are ranked in as closely in alignment with their application score as possible. Every once in a while, we have to move somebody a very slight amount because of needing to fit in one of these operational activities. Like we've got an infrastructure grant, we've got a renewing partner that is brand new or something like that. And in that case, we might move somebody in their ranking just slightly. So it's as close as we can get to a top to bottom ranking as we can. And then projects that are part of a larger grant are ranked together when we submit to HUD. So you will still receive your own project score, but when you are ranked, you will be ranked with the highest performing score, highest performing project in your grant. So I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So if we rank by project, you'll see we have our agency A, agency B, agency C. Here's our top 3. Then we have this DVTHRH project 1 that was ranked, and then so on and so forth. But now coming down here, oh, look, you see this project that scored 72. That is actually a part of this project. You see they have the same name. This grant. So you'll see that probably what we would need to do, right, is rank those two together when we submit to HUD. So you'll see that happen in just a moment. So even though this particular project got a 72, when we submit to HUD, it's going to be up here with its partner in crime. Again, HUD only cares about the grants, no matter how many projects are inside them. And so if we have, for example, a very low performing project inside of a larger grant, that can potentially adjust the ranking once we go to actually put the projects or the grants in order because of that. So once we have that put together, instead of it looking like that original format, it's going to look like this. Okay. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but I just like to explain that because I think sometimes, especially for those of you who are a part of a larger grant, you may or may not be familiar with that's how we do it. And in some cases, you can be really excited because maybe you had a rough year and your partner, one of your partners in that grant pulled you up. But that is how we do that to keep those grants, those projects together when we go right to submit to HUD. So the reallocation policy, and I want to be really, really clear about this, relates to both voluntary and involuntary reallocation. So you can voluntarily say, hey, we don't want to apply for as much money this year. We'd like to reduce our grant by $20,000. And when we go to implement that, we will account for that $20,000 so that we can give that $20,000 to a new project. You can also have involuntary reallocation where the board recommends that your grant be reduced and then approves that recommendation. So the sooner we know you have money you're willing to give up, the better. It helps us plan for the competition. And as it stands right now, we have a lot of new projects that weren't funded last year that want to request funds for this year. So the sooner we know, the happier we are so that we can help include all of that in our planning for new project applications and things like that. If you have a transition project where you are wanting to apply, take your PSH project and make it a rapid rehousing project, essentially it is a reallocation. You are saying, I do not want this $200,000 PSH project anymore. I want to replace it with a $200,000 rapid rehousing project. So even though you are transitioning the project, you're still wanting to operate something, it comes through the system as if it is a new project. Now, we are talking to the board about how we can help prioritize through some additional bonus points in the new project application, projects that are transition projects, because in the past, we haven't done that and we lost a transition project that was not selected for funding by HUD. So it's something that we know we've recognized as something we need to help bump those projects up so we don't lose them, especially if that agency has every intention of continuing to operate some program in their community. And that's really driven around community need, right? We never want to just come in and take money out of a community without being very, very thoughtful and intentional about that. So it was a misstep in our part in not this last year, but the year before. We've recognized that and we're correcting that in our policies. If you can no longer operate a project and we're not talking about you transitioning a grant to another agency, because that happens too, right? That's not what I'm talking about. If you as an agency and your community, your region are like, you know what, this just doesn't work for us anymore. We don't want to operate this project. Nobody else wants it. What we would prefer to go through and reallocate that funding in the competition, because that ensures not only will we have a faster utilization on that money for whoever wants to start using that money, but it will also mean that we're more likely to keep that money in Indiana. Because if for some reason you decide you don't want to operate it and then you can't sign the contract with us or HUD, any of those things happen, then that money goes unspent. And this is what happened to us when we lost the CoC Northwest Indiana project. We actually, we were able to reallocate it during the competition, but we probably should have done it a year earlier because they really were not able to operate that grant. And we could have had access to that money a year sooner than we did. If you want to apply for a supportive services only grant, yes. If you want to add services to your grant beyond what your current budget allows, if you have a $200,000 budget and you want to add $40,000 in services, so you want a $240,000 budget, you must apply for an expansion. It is a new project. Involuntary reallocation occurs when, this is our time we see involuntary reallocation happening, and this is how the policy speaks to it. That you are not complying with monitoring, you have had a very poor monitoring outcome, and then you're choosing not to engage in any of the corrections you need to make. You've been provided ample technical assistance and support, whether from us or us and HUD, depending on who is your grantee. The board can decide to take projects from or take funds from a project, take funds from a whole grant if it decides to. That's not something that the board takes lightly, but it is allowable in our policies, and the policies do speak to when and if that could happen. Now, the other time reallocation can happen, and this is the only other time this can happen, is if a project fails to meet spending requirements. Reallocation does not happen when your project does not score high enough on the NOFO or your ERPA. So if you scored 72 and you needed to score 75 points for automatic renewal, which is a separate policy we'll talk about, that doesn't matter in your funding decision. What matters is how much you spent, and that is what the board looks at when they decide to reallocate. So funding and resources reviews any project that's up for reallocation because they did meet expenditure requirements, and then the reallocations that are actually approved are done so at the board level. So the Funding and Resources Committee makes a recommendation to the board, and the board actually is the final say in the reallocation. So how does this work in 2023? So last year, how did this work? And I'm saying how did this work in 2023 because there is a possibility, given kind of the trends we're seeing in spending, that the threshold for this could go up slightly. I just don't know what that will be yet because the board and the committee haven't approved any amounts. First, the goal is for all projects to spend 90% of funds, and this is at a project level. So if you are in a bigger grant and your grant spent 90%, but you spent 74%, we would be talking to you about whether or not there would be some reallocation happening. It depends on your individual project and how your project spent, not the grant entirely. We have situations where the grant will be high enough, but then one individual project inside of it will not. So the spending that's reviewed is from the most recent year of all closed out grants. So in 2023, this was grants operated in 2022 and early 2023. Now, this is what also always gets confusing about CoC, right? We have some of you, Pam, I'm just going to keep picking on you, Pam. Pam was supposed to start a grant in February, right? Your Sears Hope. And of course, HUD doesn't have it ready yet. But her grant starts in February. Then we have our friends over, I believe it's RMHC, it might be, I think, Alicia, that don't start their grant until January of the following year. So it's confusing, right, to know when exactly it is we're talking about, which is why we like to use both the funding year or fiscal year term and when things were operated. So we had the grants that we evaluated were grants that ended their spending in early 2023. Projects that spent 75% or more last year were not reviewed for reallocation. So if you spent 75 to 90%, you weren't reviewed. If you spent over 90%, you weren't reviewed. You were not a part of the potential reallocation discussion. The projects that spent below 75%, so 74.99 to 50%, are reviewed, and the board can make a determination to reallocate by up to 10%. And projects that spent 49.99 or under 50% were reviewed and could have been reallocated up to 25%. In the case of last year, the board the Funding and Resources reviewed and then moved forward a proposal that pretty much reallocated directly in alignment with the policy. That is not something that I understand was done consistently in the past, where this policy always existed. It was never new, but there were all sorts of reasons why the board had decided not to administer it in the most recent years of competition. We had the pandemic. We had a year where we had no competition, and then there was a bunch of us who weren't here in 2019. So I don't know how things are done back then, but there's been a couple of years now where this wasn't applied. So we did spend some time talking to folks who were underexpended last year. And one of the things we're looking at doing into this year is essentially, if you were reallocated last year, we are putting forward a policy recommendation that we do not reallocate projects involuntarily 2 years in a row. Now, if you were involuntarily reallocated and you want to voluntarily reallocate some money, that would not be applicable in this policy. We will always allow people to voluntarily, reduce their award in order to make room for more money to come in for a new project. But I do think that given the number of reallocations we did last year and the trends that I'm seeing in the spending pattern for this most recent closeout time period of 2023 to 2024, we will likely not go back to those of you who underexpended again and ask you to do the same thing. I'll probably still reach out to you to let you know and offer you the opportunity to voluntarily reallocate, but we're not going to apply the policy unless there's some really extreme circumstance. It just, given the board's attitude about the decision we made, they were very much in favor of it, but they wanted to be very careful to make sure projects were sustainable. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to come back year over year if we haven't yet had a chance to administer the grants under the new reduced amount. So that is the only time we reallocate. So if there are projects that are reallocated, it's because they did not meet the spending threshold or because they chose to reallocate some funding from their project. So separately from reallocation, we have the scoring policy. Inside our scoring policy, we essentially set forward, and this was in 2023, and this is another point that might just move up a couple of percentage points, that if you did not score 65% of the total points, the highest points, sorry, it should say highest points, I apologize, I'll correct that for the taken out when I get this out to everybody. So if you didn't score 65% of the highest scoring project, then you are considered at risk for not being renewed. And essentially the process we engage with folks is to have a discussion, to set up some additional appointments. Those of you I've met with, nearly all of you at this point who are in that category. And we're going to have some follow-up meetings going into this spring. to make sure that people who scored lower on the NOFO are aware that they scored, on the lower end, and what corrections they may need to be considering in order to increase their score in the future. It is a 65% of the highest points scored. So last year, our highest scoring applicant had 109 points. So that meant that it's 65% of 109. So that could be in the future, it could be 65% of 120. It could be 65% of 70. And like I said, we are looking at increasing that 65% just because we're wanting to catch people sooner, not so much because we plan to be punitive and not rank the project, but just because we don't want people getting quite so low in their score before we start having the conversation. It's just, I think, more beneficial for us to be talking more if we're having any trouble with performance in the IRPA. So what are some things to know about scoring in general? Like I said, typically the renewal application has around 100 points, and then there are bonus points in it. So it's usually like 98 to 100 points, and then up to, I think the last couple of years, we've been between 15 and 20 extra bonus points. No one's ever scored, no, I shouldn't say ever. I think my first year I had somebody score perfect. But what, last year we had 109 points. So somebody had scored some bonus points beyond what they could, and they maybe missed very few or none of the points in the competitive application that they completed for their renewal. HUD is looking at a couple of things when they look at how we evaluate renewal projects, and this is what I want to hit on. We are evaluated on whether or not we are using system performance criteria. So when we start talking next week about how you are evaluated in the IRPA, some of these questions, not only are they just questions that we should be evaluating folks on because it's a good practice, they actually have to hit a HUD expectation for us too. And HUD will reduce our amount of points in our collaborative application if we're not evaluating projects on the renewal side or the new side for some of these areas. We have to have objective points. So kind of referring back to what I talked about earlier, we have to be evaluating people on equity and disparity work that they're doing and on whether or not they're really serving folks with high need. And we have been doing that consistently, and we demonstrate that to HUD every year in order to avoid losing those points. So lastly, the appeals policy, and then I'll get to some of the questions that were in the chat and any other questions folks have. So appeals policy is really straightforward. If you feel like things were improperly interpreted, if you feel like the way we were administering the policies or the policies we have are not fair or right, if they violate what you understand to be the CoC and NOFO expectations, and anytime things that have an adverse effect. So this is particularly noted, I think, just so people aren't appealing for the sake of appealing. I don't know why anyone would do that. We're all busy enough. But essentially, we wouldn't necessarily expect somebody to appeal if we accidentally gave you 2 points that we shouldn't have. If you'd like to appeal that, okay. But I think it's just to avoid any litigiousness, so that we're only really appealing things that are going to negatively impact folks. If you have an appeal, there's an appeals process that you go through. The first step is to email the community services inbox, and we conduct an informal review. And I have had less than 10 appeals since I came on staff here 2 years ago. And every time we were able to make the correction via email. And it was very simple. It was a matter of, oh, you know what, you're right. I review how a score was concluded to, and we make a correction. Oh, yep, you should have gotten that extra point, or oh, we misunderstood your APR data, and we see that there now. That's the reason why appeals go through. Now, I will say the appeals process does not allow you to resubmit any information. So if you run your APR and you have a bunch of bad data in there and you submit it with that bad data in it, and it means you score low, an appeal would not be appropriate to say, oh, hey, I did a data quality check and found I had bad data and I fixed it now. I'm appealing my score now. That is not an appeal. Now, what I will say is we're happy to work with you as long as we haven't finalized that ranking yet. We would probably work with you to fix things. And more than likely, we would probably be finding things and talking to you to say, hey, there's a problem. But that's not the appropriate use of an appeal, which is why we really need to take the next step of this process very seriously. What are the impacts of these policies generally? The biggest area where we see impacts are on the performance ranking policy. So people are unhappy with the score they received on the renewal application, and so they appeal it for some reason. Like I said, 9 times out of the 10, we've been able to fix it, no problem. Or I've been able to explain how the policy or the score was gotten to, and we come to an agreement like, yep, you were right. That was the score I should have received. It was actually 10 times out of 10 that this has happened so far. So we see it in that. So paying attention to what your score is and making sure you're prepared. Our scoring tool is available from last year. If you wanted to go self-score yourself now, you could. So preparing yourself mentally to know kind of where you're sitting at is important. And the other thing we typically see some conversation or concern about is reallocation, which is why I really wanted to dive into that today. So what are some things, what these policies mean for you? It means that you should start preparing now. Look at, most importantly, please look at your HMIS data, run an APR, and I know that it can be a pain in the tooth, but please run an APR for the calendar year. That's what we use in the competition. We will use 1/1/2023 to 12/31/23, that calendar year for everybody. Run that report for yourself. Take a look at what you see, run the reports that the HMIS team recommend for you to do. In particular, there is an APR CAPER review tool report that you can run in HMIS. There's instructions for how to run that report on the IHCDA website where the HMIS data lives, or the HMIS information lives. I'll actually provide a link right now to where you can find these recommended reports and take a look. One of the most recent things, and next week our HMIS team will be much more involved than the conversation we had today. One of the best things I've seen our HMIS team introduce recently was a new report for the annual assessment. So if you go into this page I just provided, you scroll down to how-to guides, you can see the new annual assessment tool report that they've created, which allows you to find out when are your annual assessments due for each of the clients in your programs. Because when you run the APR, those of you who don't do closeouts for your grant may not know this. If you run your APR and you see a bunch of people are missing income information, this was the number one, our lowest scoring criteria, missing income information. And not because people aren't getting income. Thank you. It's because, and maybe that they're not getting input, but when you have missing data, it's because you're not entering in that annual assessment. The annual assessment's only open for 60 days around their annual assessment date. And their new report that they have, that tool will be so helpful to identifying for you when those are due. You can put them in your calendar or your SAS calendar, and will hopefully make a big difference in your data quality when it comes to questions, especially around income, because that's usually one of our biggest heavy hitters. Take a look at the materials you see on that internal competition site. Like I said, a lot of our stuff is going to look very similar to last year. So if you don't remember what we asked about on last year's competition for renewal projects, there's the scoring tool at that webpage that says internal competition. You can go look at it. It's going to be pretty similar to what we asked you about last year. Ask us questions, engage in these sessions, and make sure that if you were underspent last year, if you were below 75%, we're not looking at making that number 70. We're looking at potentially making that number 78 or 80% this year, because we have quite a number of folks that we reallocated last year that won't be up for reallocation. And we want to continue to try and get closer to making sure we have 90% of grant funds spent. Anybody who's up for reallocation is provided the opportunity to provide a rationale to the Funding and Resources Committee about why they were underspent. And the committee does take that into consideration on whether or not they move forward with a reallocation. Okay, I talked your ear off, and I want to get to some of the questions that I saw in the chat. So we already got to some of the questions about expansion, because I wanted to make sure I addressed those since I didn't know if I'd get to them next week. And Kelly, I'm going to assume that your question about projects being chosen for DV bonus, meaning how does HUD decide whether or not DV bonus projects are funded? Because as it stands right now at the competition level for us, we have never had a DV bonus project come into the competition that was not included in the ranking, not since I've been here. So if that ever happened in the past, I can't speak to it. But essentially, as long as we include it in the ranking, we put it up to HUD, and HUD makes the decision. So I'm going to assume you're asking about why would HUD, or why would HUD not choose our DV bonus project? So the DV bonus project is selected by HUD on two main factors. First, the quality of the project application itself related to the specific work you're saying you're going to do with this project funds. The other half of that decision is based upon the CoC's response to the component of the collaborative application that relates to DV bonus. This most recent year of funding, we applied for a DV bonus project that was not selected for funding. We have applied in the past as well. The threshold in this most recent competition for HUD to select a DV bonus project was 86.2 points, 86.24 points maybe. We scored just around 82 points. So we were right out of that threshold. I have some takeaways from looking at the debrief that HUD has given us on our score about how we can improve that score in the future. And if we do want to go after DV bonus funds again, I've got some recommendations for however we want to participate in that. So in the past, when we've gotten that debrief score, we've been 30, in some cases, 20 points below the threshold to be selected. So the fact that we were so close this year, I think means we're on the right track, but that we still have some improvements to make. I hope that helps answer your question, Kelly. Like I said, I would never anticipate for us to apply for more DV bonus than we have available. We usually have like $1.5 million or $2 million that we can apply for, maybe even more than that. So I would anticipate us being able to always fit all the DV bonus we'd want in the ranking. We try to do our best to apply for every dollar and include all of the projects that we can fit. So definitely don't want to leave any money on the table. Any other questions? And Lori's put some great information in the chat here about where to look for the APR CAPR review tool and review your data quality. Yes, please submit help desk tickets. Alicia, Joe Rita, and I are big fans of all of you. Unfortunately, we are not able to help you with your HMIS help desk tickets. So if you see something on that report or you log into HMIS and you don't know what's going on, and you email us, we will direct you over to the help desk to make sure that you submit that. Just like any tech system, filing it and sending it to the help desk means that it starts a ticketing process so that our team can be as responsive to you as they can be, and ensures a quicker response than reaching out to us directly. Yes, and then yes, DV client track APR questions, go to the DV help desk. Thank you, Lori. Great reminder. So for next week, what we will be doing is going through what we anticipate to be the main areas of scoring for the competition. I'm going to be more than happy to take any feedback about what you see in the competition itself to make sure we have those questions answered before we have anything. And also to provide any feedback you provide to the committee that will ultimately decide what's included in the renewal application. Casey, I think you had your hand up. What's up? I'm going to try and unmute you if you can't unmute yourself. Looks like you... is it going to let you? No.
I think so.
Okay, hi. Yes, I can hear you.
Hey, okay, so I just had a quick question, and this is like specific to my agency, A Better Way. If we do currently receive DV bonus funds through ICTA, is that like going to impact us since we didn't get to be funded for the DV bonus funds?
No. So good question. So we applied for new DV bonus. Our existing DV bonus was a part of the renewal portion of the application. It was included in the portion of the ranking that scored high enough to be included in the protected portion and did receive funding. We did not lose any renewal projects in the competition. So if you renewed last year, you are part of the group. We do have some, I think Joe Rita and I will be connecting with those projects that are DV bonus to talk about some of that expenditure questions that we had going into this contracting year for DV rapid rehousing in particular. And I've been having some other conversations with partners recently who want to make sure that they have good use of funds and maybe have questions about whether or not they want to make any funding available inside that grant to others to take because they can't spend it all. So yeah. We'll be reaching out to you with that. But as far as what you need to do, if you are a DV bonus grant funded partner, if you've got that as a renewal, you will participate in the renewal application process just like everybody else. We'll look for you guys. I think last year you guys didn't have a full year of operations yet to be included in the competitive portion. So again, because you'll be ranked with the entire grant, we'll still want you to complete the IRPA. And I believe this will be your first year to receive that competitive score. And depending on, if you happen to be the highest scoring in the grant, we'd rank that grant wherever you guys scored. But otherwise you'd just be pulled in with everybody else, but still participating fully. Good question.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Since we have just a minute, I'll just remind folks, additionally, separate from, the preparation you can be doing on your data, please make sure that if you need to modify your budget, you do that before the competition starts. You cannot modify your budget in the competition. So if you want to somehow change your budget from having $30,000 in services to $60,000 in services, but you still want to operate a $200,000 grant, and you're not increasing the size of your grant, you can't do that in eSnaps. If you try to do it in eSnaps, we'll push it back to you. Howard usually catches those when people try to. Otherwise, HUD won't let us do that. Additionally, if you're not familiar, HUD usually does not allow budget modifications. They don't really process modifications during the competition because they're doing other things for the competition. So if you know you need to modify your budget, please let us know ASAP, because we need to get that in front of our board committee. We need to get that approved and make sure we get that through, especially before the GIW comes, because that is always a nightmare when that happens and we're trying to do the GIW at the same time. So if you want the funding to look a certain way in eSnaps, make sure you make that correction now and we get it in, and that when you go to see that, that it is right in the GIW, so that you're not, left standing. Now, if it doesn't happen, what do? We just submit it again next year. It's unfortunately the process we have to go through, but it's not like it can never happen. It just means you have to sometimes do things later or multiple times. Well, we will see you next week. Next week, we'll dive into that application tool itself, go into any other questions you have about, implications of policy, and have our HMIS team here to answer any questions you might have about what you're seeing in your renewal, your APR. So if you haven't run it recently, or you haven't run that recommended tool that Lori put in the chat, maybe do that between this week and next. And then keep an eye on your calendar too. I am going to host one more additional session for folks later in April, again, to just make sure we feel really prepared for that IRPA process that I think we're going to have kickoff sometime in May, hopefully. So I appreciate everybody's time today and hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you. And shout out to my team members for being here. Thank you guys for listening. And I appreciate our HMIS team being here too, guys. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thanks, Rachel. Did a great job.